the status quo. And that's unfortunate. Because, and I'm just yet another University of Wisconsin, this is somebody on the University of Wisconsin faculty who shall remain nameless, University of Wisconsin-Madison in this case, sent me some more propaganda from the University of Wisconsin Health Services and the University of Wisconsin-Madison Student Affairs offices, including everything from grousing about how the advertisements for the mechanical engineering program at the University of Wisconsin are too white and too many students are too white and too male, to the University of Wisconsin Health Services posting up little pictures of gingerbread men, calling them genderbread persons, and teaching people how men are women and women are men and there is no such thing as sex. So that's something that's going to get worse in these next 4 years, because there's no way the Republicans, number one, will do anything, and number two, Tony Evers would sign. But this is why the opportunity missed in the last legislative session is so painful. Duke Pesta on the phone at the University of Wisconsin Oshkosh. No free speech legislation, Duke. We're not going to see anything done to rein in the University of Wisconsin budget abuses. We're not going to see any ideological diversity mandated on campus. We are not going to see any improvements to the actual process of K-12 education in our state. That all ground to a halt because those issues just didn't rise to the level of interest for a sufficient number of conservatives in the legislature.
Well, pardon me, Vicki, the fact that before something can grind to a halt, it actually has to move in the first place. For the last 8 to 10 years, we've had a Republican legislature that is not the least bit interested in educational reform. They have initiated absolutely nothing to address the failed schools. They have done nothing to take power away from the DPI. They have done nothing to address bias and one-sided views on college campuses. Look, I teach at University of Wisconsin-Oshkosh. I remember when Donald Trump won the election 2 years ago, there was a concerned letter from the chancellor that went out. Anybody who needs counseling to deal with the impending Republican takeover of the White House, well, we're going to have all sorts of resources at UW-Oshkosh that we're going to use to counsel you. And now the Democrats just swept into the Congress, and there wasn't a single note from the chancellor saying, hey, any of you distraught conservatives, anybody distraught by the fact that the governor's mansion in Wisconsin is being taken over by a radical lefty, we will use our resources to come. None of that stuff at all. And this is all because for 8 to 10 years, when Republicans had every aspect of Wisconsin state government in their hands, they chose to do nothing. They chose to leave as the chair of the Education Committee in the Senate, Luther Olson, a pro-Common Core man with a huge conflict of interest. His own wife works for CISA 6. When we were fighting Common Core, Vicki, back 5, 6, 7 years ago, we would talk to state legislators about Common Core. Even when we would find state legislators who actually didn't like Common Core, they said the same thing to us. Well, as long as Luther Olson remains the chair of education, we will get nothing done. The very few things that we managed to push through the assembly, Luther Olson stymied them in committee.
Yep.
And so what do you say about Voss and what do you say about Fitzgerald? They deserve a tremendous amount of blame for what just happened to Governor Walker. Because every time the good people of Wisconsin got behind initiatives and thought that Republicans in the legislature had our back, it was Voss and Fitzgerald who never let it get to the desk of Walker to begin with.
Here's some others. You mentioned Common Core, and by the way, Common Core now has proved to be a spectacular failure in terms of student proficiency results. We've seen that, but it's also made it even harder to eliminate the indoctrination. We'll get to some of that in a second, because now it's becoming abundantly more clear what we were talking about and what we were warning about just a couple of years ago. But a couple of other things. And you're right. Think about the fetal body parts legislation that was proposed by Andre Jacques and did not get anywhere. I mean, all we wanted to do was to tell the University of Wisconsin, the University of Wisconsin Foundation, we wanted to tell the Milwaukee School of Health that they were not going to be able to harvest aborted fetuses and sell them for research purposes. That it was horrifying, and that piece of legislation could not get advanced to the point where it wound up on Governor Walker's desk for a signature. That's how ridiculous things had gotten in terms of the initiatives that the citizens, that different conservative groups got behind. The pro-life constituency in Wisconsin is powerful, and it couldn't get something that obvious passed.
And it's not just that unborn babies were being ripped to shreds and sold for profit. The fact is that Andre Jacques, who courageously tried to push it through the legislature, was stymied by his own people. And then the Republicans in the House and the Senate waged a war against Andre Jacques, running another Republican against him to get rid of him. It shows you that the good folks that run the Assembly and the Senate, Fitzgerald and Voss, are much more actively angry and proactive against Republicans who step off the reservation and try to do what the people want than they were in fighting Democrat initiatives.
More energy was put behind this last fall's gas tax push, the last budget's gas tax push, than ever was put behind trying to get the aborted fetal tissue bill passed, or doing anything to remove Common Core. Let's talk specifically about Common Core. Common Core, which has resulted in dumber kids than we already had coming out of a dumbed down indoctrination factory of K-12. It's even worse now. And on top of it, on top of the fact that we are exposing fewer children to literature and fewer children to rational math algorithms, on top of all of that, the materials themselves are meant to push a liberal left-wing social justice agenda. So they are getting social justice. We are teaching them to deconstruct logic. We are teaching them to deconstruct rights. We are teaching them to deconstruct the Constitution. We are not asking them to read actual material and understand history or literature or how to develop the pathways of critical thought. And on top of that, we're substituting what at least used to be decent reading material, or at least decent ways to understand how to do mathematics, with social justice, with lectures on gender, with lectures on immigration, with lectures on rape culture. That's what has substituted for the material in the classroom now.
Yes, absolutely. What has happened right under our eyes, and we said it was going to happen. Common Core,
and they told us you were nuts. They told you specifically you were nuts.
Yep, and what we said was going to happen is what happened. Both at the college level and at the elementary, middle, and high school level, you have had an administrative coup. In the middle schools, high schools, and in the college campuses, the admins have come in, the diversity officers have come in, Common Core has enabled ideological activists to come into the schools, and to circumvent the direct education your kids used to get between teacher and student. An education based on reading, writing, math, ABCs, and 1, 2, 3s has now been quietly from the inside hollowed out. And at these major college campuses, you have 60, 70, 90 diversity officers whose sole job is to oversee the transition of what your kids learn at every level, from mastery of skills to ideological control. And that covers every aspect of what we've talked about in here. The NAEP scores, the National Nonpartisan NAEP scores, as we talked about on your show 3 months ago, for this year in Wisconsin demonstrate that only 37% of Wisconsin 8th graders, 37% of Wisconsin 8th graders can read at an 8th grade level. Only 35% of Wisconsin 8th graders can do math at an 8th grade level. They're 1, 2, 3 years behind. And in the big cities, places where Tony Evers seemed to pretend to care enough, Milwaukee, it's 18% of 8th graders are proficient in those subjects. And yet this is the guy who single-handedly brought Common Core, federal control of education, an education that strips your kids in Wisconsin of mastery and skills for life and replaces it with left-wing political ideology. That guy, whose own system now has failed dramatically, is the governor of your state. And I'll go one step further. Scott Walker, for 8 years, was hesitant to say a negative word about Tony Evers. When we had Republican candidates run for DPI head over the last 8 years, 2 of them. Nobody can even name them anymore. The Republicans in the Assembly and the Senate did not support them. The Walker administration, the Republicans who run the Assembly and the Senate, were more comfortable with left-wing Tony Evers running the DPI than they were with their own Republican candidates running for the job. Now, who had the last laugh? Because Tony Evers, that skeleton on a stick, is now the governor of the state of Wisconsin.
I'm stealing that line. The skeleton on a stick. I was referring to him as Mr. Burns. That's how I was, or the smirking chimp, something like that. But you're exactly right. And how do you not use some things like, for instance, when Alberta Darling and Dale Koyenga had put forth a modest reform, a decent reform, but a modest reform on just a handful of failing schools in Milwaukee, which would have given control of those schools to a separate and independent board run by the county executive, who didn't, by the way, we should point out in Milwaukee County, didn't want the job, because these were schools that had 0 kids, 0 human beings, 0 reading and doing math at grade level. 0. They were breathing in and out. That's what they were doing in their classrooms, was breathing in and out. And that was it. And Tony Evers decided to redefine failure as meets expectations. So that those, 8 schools, 7 or 8 schools that were going to be addressed by this one particular reform would never be able to be reformed in a way that would get those kids from 0 kids to, I don't know, maybe 37%. I mean, they were at 0. 37% would have been a spectacular success. But Tony Evers' DPI redefined failure to meet expectations. That's something you could have easily used in a campaign, but you're exactly right. Everybody treated this guy like he was like he needed to be special, like you couldn't say anything about him, and you didn't. And suburban moms don't want you to trash on education. Well, suburban moms, if they knew how bad their classrooms were for their kids, would be pissed off and would want something to change. But if you never talk about it, if you never create the narrative, if you never expose this crap, was it now 2 years ago, my colleague Dan O'Donnell did the Blood on the Blackboard series, exposing the pathetic lack of discipline in the schools, which is making an already bad situation even worse and more chaotic and violent. You can't make that matter to suburban moms. You got something wrong with you.
Yeah, and this starts at the top, unfortunately. I mean, I love Leah Vukmir, and I remember 5 and 6 years ago, she was an advocate against Common Core. She came to some of our Common Core talks, and then mysteriously, she got these national aspirations. She joined ALEC, a huge, major corporate lobbying firm, deep up to the elbows in Common Core, and Leah said nothing about Common Core in her campaign. Look, Common Core, you mentioned suburban moms and how suburban moms don't want to see their schools maligned. Nonsense. When I was touring this state 5 years ago, I gave 150 talks on Common Core in this state. It was all suburban moms, and they were outraged. It was suburban moms who gave the Republicans back the House and the Senate 2 and 3 and 4 years ago. And yet, how did we pay them back? By making the schools worse, by letting Tony Evers implement without any oversight or control, by refusing to challenge any of the unconstitutional and educationally devastating initiatives that he put in. Can you name the last time Scott Walker talked about education that I remember hearing him was 3 weeks before he dropped out of the presidency race a couple of years ago, after declaring that he had gotten rid of Common Core. Scott, with all due respect, that ended your presidency. The final nail in the coffin of your presidency run is when you said publicly, a few weeks before you dropped out, you had gotten rid of Common Core. I had activists all over the country calling me disappointed in you. It's one thing not to do anything about Common Core. It's another thing, like so many Republicans across the 50 states have done. Simply rename Common Core, call it the Badger State tests, or call them the Badger State standards, or whatever you want to do. Simply go ahead and keep Common Core and rename it, and pretend Republican supporters are too stupid to know what you did, and then brag about having gotten rid of it. If you guys had made education, and this goes for Leah, this goes for Scott Walker, this goes for Republicans all across the states, if you had foregrounded what progressives were doing to our kids in public schools, you would not see the blood on the Republican candidates that we saw in the last few weeks. It's going to get worse. It's going to get worse in the next 4 years too.
It's going to get worse because now they're teaching young people to unlearn the very concepts of civility themselves. Duke Pesta, thanks very much for coming on the program. Good to have you.
Thank you.
All right. We'll be right back.